Welcome to this article where we take a look at the background of the Battle of Plassey. The Carnatic Wars. The War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, marked the beginning of the power struggle between two great superpowers, Britain and France, and of European military ascendancy and political intervention in the Indian subcontinent. Let's take a look what was the War of the Austrian Succession. The War of the Austrian Succession was the last great power conflict, with the Bourbon-Habsburg dynastic conflict at its heart. It occurred from 1740 to 1748 and marked the rise of Prussia as a major power. Related conflicts included King George's War, War of Jenkins' Year, the First Carnatic War, and the First and the Second Silesian Wars. The pretext for the war was Maria Theresa's right to inherit her father's Emperor Charles VI's crown in the Habsburg monarchy, but France, Prussia, and Bavaria really saw it as an opportunity to challenge the Habsburg power. Maria Theresa was backed by Britain, the Dutch Republic, and Hanover, which were collectively known as the Pragmatic Allies. As the conflict widened, it drew in other participants. Among them, Spain, Sardinia, Saxony, Sweden, and Russia. There were four primary theaters of the war: Central Europe, the Austrian, Netherlands, Italy, and the seas. Prussia occupied Silesia in 1740 and repulsed Austrian efforts to regain it, and between 1745 to 48, France conquered most of the Austrian Netherlands. Elsewhere, Austria and Sardinia defeated Spanish attempts to regain territories in northern Italy, and by 1747, the British naval blockade was crippling French trade. The war ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, by which Maria Theresa was confirmed as Archduchess of Austria and the Queen of Hungary. The treaty reflected that stalemate, since most of the commercial issues that had led to the war were left unresolved, and many of the signatories were unhappy with the terms. Although the war had nearly bankrupted the state, Louis XV of France withdrew from the Low Countries for minimal benefit, to the dismay of France's nobility and populace. The Spanish considered their gains in Italy inadequate, since they had failed to recover Minorca or Gibraltar, and viewed the reassertion of British commercial rights in the Americas as an insult. So we can see there were so many unresolved and unhappy parties at the end of the war. Let's go back to how it influenced the Battle of Plassey. In September 1746, Mahe de la Bourdonnais landed off Madras with a naval squadron and laid siege to the port city of Madras. The defenses of Madras were weak, and the garrison sustained a bombardment of 3 days before surrendering. The terms of the surrender agreed by Bourdonnais provided for the settlement to be ransomed back for a cash payment by the British East India Company. However, this concession was opposed by Joseph Francois Dupleix, the Governor-General of the Indian possessions of the Compagnie des Indes Orientales. When Bourdonnais left India in October, Dupleix reneged on the agreement. The Nawab of the Carnatic, Anwaruddin Khan, intervened in support of the British, and the combined forces advanced to retake Madras. But despite vast superiority in numbers, the army was easily crushed by the French. The Battle of Ambur was the first major battle of the Second Carnatic War. As a retaliation to the loss of Madras, the British, under Major Lawrence and Admiral Boscawen, laid siege to Pondicherry. The siege to Pondicherry was conducted by British forces against a French East India Company garrison under the command of Governor-General Joseph Francois Dupleix at the Indian port of Pondicherry. But they were forced to raise it after 31 days. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 forced Dupleix to yield Madras back to the British in return for Louisbourg and Cape Breton Island in North America. Let's take a look at the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. The 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, sometimes called the Treaty of Aachen, ended the War of the Austrian Succession following a congress assembled on 24th April 1748 at the Free Imperial city of Aachen. The two main protagonists in the war, Britain and France, opened peace talks in the Dutch city of Breda in 1746. Agreement was delayed by British hopes of improving their position. When this failed to occur, a draft treaty was agreed on 30th April 1748. A final version was signed on 18th October 1748 by Britain, France, and the Dutch Republic. The terms were then presented to the other belligerents, who could either accept them or continue the war on their own. Austria, Spain, and Sardinia had little choice but to comply, and signed separately. The Duchy of Modena and Republic of Genoa joined together on 21st January 1749. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle largely failed to resolve the issues that caused the war, while most of the signatories were unhappy with the terms. Maria Theresa resented Austria's exclusion from the talks and blamed Britain for forcing her to accept the concessions, while British politicians felt they had received little benefit for the financial subsidies paid to her. The combination of factors led to the strategic realignment known as the Diplomatic Revolution, which ultimately resulted in the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1756. Let's go back to the Carnatic Wars, which was a cause of the Battle of Plassey. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle thus prevented direct hostilities between the two powers, but soon they were involved in indirect hostilities as the auxiliaries of the local princes in their feuds. The feud Dupleix chose was for the succession to the positions of the Nizam of the Deccan and the Nawab of the independent Carnatic province. The British and the French both nominated their candidates for the two posts of Nizam and Nawab. In both cases, Dupleix's candidates usurped both thrones by manipulation and 2 assassinations. In mid-1751, the French candidate for the Nawab's post, Chanda Sahib, laid siege to the British candidate Wallaja's last stronghold, Trichinopoli, where Wallaja was holed up with his British reinforcements. He was aided by a French force under Charles Marquis de Bussy. He was the Governor-General of the French colony of Pondicherry from 1783 to 1785. On 1st September 1751, 280 Europeans and 300 sepoys under the command of Captain Robert Clive attacked and seized Arcot, the capital of the Carnatic, finding that the garrison had fled the night before. It was hoped that this would force Chanda Sahib to divert some of his troops to wrest the city back from the British. Chanda Sahib sent a force of 4,000 Indians under Raja Sahib and 150 Frenchmen. They besieged the fort and breached the walls in various places after several weeks, Robert Clive sent out a message to Morari Rao, a Maratha chieftain who had received a subsidy to assist Walaja and was encamped in the Mysore hills. Raja Sahib, learning of the imminent Maratha approach, sent a letter to Robert Clive asking him to surrender in return for a large sum of money, but his offer was refused. In the morning of 24th November, Raja Sahib tried to mount a final assault on the fort, but was foiled in his attempt when his armoured elephants stampeded due to the British musketry. They tried to enter the fort through the breach several times, but always repulsed with loss. The siege was raised the next day, and Raja Sahib's forces fled from the scene, abandoning guns, ammunition, and stores. With success at Arcot, Conjeevaram, and Trichinopoli, the British secured the Carnatic, and Walaja succeeded to the throne of the Nawab in accordance with a treaty with the new French governor. Alwardi Khan ascended to the throne of the Nawab of Bengal after his army attacked and captured the capital of Bengal, Murshidabad. Alivardi's attitude to the Europeans in Bengal is said to be strict. During his wars with the Marathas, he allowed the strengthening of fortifications by the Europeans and the construction of the Maratha Ditch in Calcutta by the British. On the other hand, Alivardi collected large amounts of money from them for the upkeep of his war. He was well informed of the situation in southern India, where the British and the French had started a proxy war using the local princes and rulers. Alwardi did not wish such a situation to transpire in his province and thus exercised caution in his dealings with the Europeans. However, there was a continual friction. The British always complained that they were prevented from the full enjoyment of the Farman of 1717 issued by Farooq Sir. The British, however, protected subjects of the Nawab, gave passes to native traders to trade custom-free, and levied large duties on goods coming to their districts, actions which were detrimental to the Nawab's revenue. In 1756 April, Alwardi Khan died and was succeeded by his 23-year-old grandson Siraj-ud-Dawla. His personality was said to be a combination of a ferocious temper and feeble understanding. Siraj-ud-Dawla was particularly suspicious of the large profits made by the European companies in India. When the British and the French started improving their fortifications in anticipation of another war between them, he immediately ordered them to stop such activities as they had been done without permission. When the British refused to cease their constructions, the Nawab led a detachment of 3,000 men to surround the fort and factory of Qasim Bazar and took several British officials as prisoners before moving to Calcutta. The defences of Calcutta were weak and negligible. The garrison consisted of only 180 soldiers, 50 European volunteers, 60 European militia, 150 Armenian and Portuguese militia, 35 European artillerymen, and 40 volunteers from ships, and was pitted against the Nawab's force of nearly 50,000 infantry and cavalry. The city was occupied on 16th June by Siraj's force, and the fort surrendered after a brief siege on 20th June. The prisoners who were captured at the siege of Calcutta were transferred by Siraj to the care of the officers of his guard, who confined them to the common dungeon of Fort William known as the Black Hole. This dungeon, the Black Hole, 18 feet by 14 feet in size with two small windows, had 146 prisoners thrust into it, originally employed by the British to hold only 6 prisoners. On 21st June, the doors of the dungeon were opened and only 23 of the 146 walked out. The rest had died of asphyxiation, heat exhaustion, and delirium. It appears that the Nawab was unaware of the conditions in which his prisoners were held, which resulted in the unfortunate deaths of most of the prisoners. Meanwhile, the Nawab's army and navy were busy plundering the city of Calcutta and the other British factories in the surrounding areas. When the news of the fall of Calcutta broke in Madras on 16th August 1756, the council immediately sent out an expeditionary force under Colonel Robert Clive and Admiral Watson. A letter from the council of Fort St. George states that the object of the expedition was not merely to re-establish the British settlements in Bengal, but also to obtain ample recognition of the company's privileges and reparation for its losses, without the risk of war. It also states that any signs of dissatisfaction and ambition among the Nawab's subjects must be supported. Robert Clive assumed command of the land forces, consisting of 900 Europeans and 1500 sepoys, while Watson commanded a naval squadron. The fleet entered the Hooghly River in December and met with the fugitives of Calcutta and the surrounding areas, including the principal members of the council, at the village of Falta on 15th December. The members of council formed a select committee of direction. On 29th December, the force dislodged the enemy from the fort of Bajbaj. Robert Clive and Watson then moved against Calcutta on 2nd January 1757, and the garrison of 500 men surrendered after offering a scanty resistance. With Calcutta recaptured, the council was reinstated and a plan of action against the Nawab was prepared. The fortifications of Fort William were strengthened and a defensive position was prepared in the northeast of the city. Thank you for listening to this article where we explore the Carnatic Wars as the background of the Battle of Plassey.